I'm excited to kick off the strategy track of Emerge Insights. Over the course of the sessions yesterday and today, we've heard so much about the great work that's happening around the globe to improve financial health. Implementing these measurement tools and solutions requires companies to invest. With me today to talk about the business case and ROI for financial health is Mohamed Khalil. He's the General Manager of Financial Wellbeing and Applied Behavioral Science at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Mo, welcome to Emerge Insights.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
So you founded the Financial Wellbeing and Applied Behavioral Sciences team at Commonwealth Bank of Australia about 3 years ago. And since then, you've grown it to be a multidisciplinary team that has influence and impact really across the entire bank. Tell us a little bit more about your journey.
Sure. So actually about 5 years ago, Commonwealth Bank reached out to me, and the reason was that they, like every other bank on the planet, had a purpose centered around financial well-being. And if you look at the vision statements of any of the major banks around the world, they all have this core premise around supporting the prosperity and success of their customers. And my background, I spent all of my career really trying to understand this space. And they said, well, why don't you come over, see if there's something that you could potentially help us to do here, because we're really trying to do this and we'd want a little bit more thinking here. So I joined the organization primarily because of the advanced digital capabilities they had, the scale that the Commonwealth Bank has in Australia, and this commitment to purpose. And after about a year and a half of really understanding their capabilities, I was able to get support from the head of the retail bank to begin to build this team. And we started with 2 people, a financial wellbeing strategist and a behavioral scientist. We're now a little bit over 20 people. And the team is originally sat in the digital space because that is where we could have had the most rapid impact in terms of our activities. But over time, we've actually now moved into the group strategy function. And that has been sort of a maturity process that we've gone through, where we started by building capabilities, building toolkits, building evidence base, and starting to drive some innovation. And now that we've got a scaled team operating at the group strategy level to really drive the insights and innovation across the group.
And give our listeners and viewers, most of whom are from the United States, just give them a little bit of a sense of the size and scope of CBA in the context of Australia.
So CBA has relationships with 1 in 2 Australians and is the main financial institution for 1 out of 3 Australians. It is the largest bank in Australia. It actually has a very storied history. It's over 100 years old. Originally was part of the government as part of the Reserve Bank. And then was spun out separately 105 years ago, went public in 1995, and has always been sort of part of the Australian story. So, CBA has been here throughout world wars, depressions, all of the challenges that this country's faced, as well as this recent pandemic. And so there's a very unique role that this organization plays in this society, not just as a private institution owned by 800,000 shareholders, but also as a sense of as part of the public psyche.
So your team, I think, is different to some of the others that banks elsewhere have established because you've really put an emphasis on science. For instance, you've done many partnerships with Harvard's STAR Lab, you've done work with our Leaders Lab, and you've had projects published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. As we talk about the business case, and that's what this session is about, this sounds like it would take a lot of time and money. Why go to these lengths?
Because it's a lot more expensive if you don't. So, one of the things that our team brought to this vision of financial well-being was discipline. And discipline in sort of the truest sense of the word. Is there a particular method, a process, a way in which we can approach this problem to really drive meaningful impact and change? And when we started to look at financial well-being, what we found was that it lacked a lot of discipline. Lots of really good intentioned people across the bank doing some very good things. But the first thing was that we couldn't measure what financial well-being was and the impact we were having. And the second was that there wasn't a clear process by which we could develop financial well-being solutions. And so bringing science has actually made us far more efficient and far more impactful. The application of the scientific method has actually allowed my team to be able to generate 10x return in a 1-year time horizon on almost every project we've engaged in. Now, it does take some, convincing initially, because we know that teams are operating under constraints from a funding perspective, from a timing perspective, from a resourcing perspective. But once we had a few examples under our belt where we demonstrated that when you bring this discipline of science and the scientific method, most importantly, the how, to the way you approach things, you're actually able to truly be agile, because we force you to define clearly your hypothesis. We bring the best understanding of human financial decision-making and move teams away from intuitive answers. And then we iterate the solution, proving various points along the way. And what that allows us to do is to pivot away from things that don't work very quickly and pivot closer and closer towards solutions that do work at scale. And as a result, we've done efforts, for example, in the lending space where our impact has generated tens of and hundreds of millions of dollars of impact very quickly because we brought that discipline.
So probably, I'm guessing the very first project was the one that was hardest to convince leaders about. But once anyone would see a 10x return, it must get easier from there.
Yes, and that's also because it's not just about discipline, it's also about courage. So, one of the first projects we did, which is the Harvard Business School case study on the credit card experience, was about bringing greater transparency to credit cards. So we have 9 credit cards at the time, and our Harvard partners said, listen, you visit the page and it tells you how amazing each card is, but that doesn't really tell the customer a lot about what's best for them. And so we started on this journey of saying, let's bring some transparency to our credit card experience by showing trade-offs. This card is great for these types of things, and here's the trade-off. If you don't travel, then you don't need the travel insurance, you don't need these points. Now, to go to a credit card team and tell them, we'd like you to tell people why they shouldn't buy your product is a difficult thing to do. And it took courage on the part of the credit card team to go, you know what, if this is what the science is pointing to, let's test it. It brings transparency to the customer experience. It begins to advance well-being. And when we ran it, what we found was that we were able to increase spend from day one on card by 10%, reduce attrition a year later by 20%, and we reduced the probability of late payments. And so we improved well-being and we drove positive commercial impact, but it took courage initially. And once you have enough people who have the courage to take on sort of this approach, what you find is that others rapidly sort of clamor for the same types of services.
So our efforts around building a measurement methodology and framework were running really in parallel to yours. In fact, you may be slightly ahead of us. And you worked with, I think, with the Melbourne Institute to build your own financial well-being scale a few years ago. Talk to us a little bit about how that scale is being used today and what you've learned as a result of deploying it in the bank.
Yeah, so as when we first started, one of the challenges we had was we said, listen, you have financial well-being as your purpose, and yet we don't have a clear definition, a clear way to measure it. What if we brought the same type of thinking that we have in terms of 2 other metrics that have visibility from all the way from the front line to the boardroom, and those are ROI and NPS, right? Everyone from the front line all the way up to the top level can find those metrics, understands their impact on the organization, and has clear visibility of that. So, if we want to be able to drive towards this purpose, we need an equivalent metric that has that level of visibility. And let's make sure that it is rigorous and scientific. And so let's work with experts. So we reached out to the Melbourne Institute and we spent almost 2 years developing this metric. And some of the really interesting things that were unexpected that emerged from it was, first of all, that there were two measures of well-being. We found that there was an observed measure based on data, and that it was related to but distinct from a perceived measure based on survey data. How you feel about your financial well-being is generally aligned against how you're doing, but not always the case. And that level of insight is really helpful because we found that a third of customers aren't feeling in alignment with how they're doing. The second key insight was that because it was a very rigorous measure, we were able to determine what are the true drivers of financial well-being. And what emerged as the most powerful drivers of financial well-being were behavior, and surprisingly, access to government support. And so the fact that behavior was such a big driver, much more important than income. You can make $100,000 more income, but if you don't change your habit, your financial well-being does not change. That insight gave us a lot more confidence in building out our behavioral science capability. And it also gave us confidence that our attempts to nudge people to intervene in ways that change behavior would have a meaningful effect. Ultimately, what that means, though, is that now that we have this measure, which we calculate for all of our main financial institution customers, the 1 in 3 Australians, is that we can monitor financial well-being. So as the COVID crisis has developed, we've actually been able to see what's happening with our customer population on a month-to-month basis. And we've been able to actually share that with government providers and agencies that are really trying to figure out how to best support the community. The second is that we are now able to measure the impact of specific interventions. So given that we apply the scientific method, that we do randomized control trials, we can see that this particular service, feature, solution actually fundamentally change or improve financial well-being. And that's also very, very important because it gives us a sense of how we're progressing. And finally, we were able to show how financial well-being relates to other commercial drivers.
Say more about that last part.
So, if you think about the world in terms of ROI and NPS, ROI and NPS drive fundamental decision-making, throughout the organization in terms of where to allocate resources and whether the solutions that are being designed are meeting customer needs or making them happy. And what we said was, okay, now that we've got this rigorous measure of well-being, does it tell us something different? And how does it relate to these two measures? And so when we looked at ROI through the lens of well-being, what we saw was that financial well-being is a long-term measure of ROI. So where we saw customers' well-being improve, we saw that their ROI improved by 1 to 5x that change. And where we saw financial well-being decline, we saw that their ROI declined by 3 to 6x that change. Now that's specific to our context, and I'm sure every organization will find different correlations, but it really proved to us that, hey, if you focus on well-being, you're actually improving ROI. The second thing that we saw was that when we looked at it through the lens of NPS satisfaction, was that there were very similar correlations there as well, that customers with the lowest well-being were the ones who were least satisfied, and customers with higher well-being were more satisfied. And that sort of brought a third cone to the retina, so to speak, where instead of a black and white world of ROI and NPS, we now had this very nuanced, colored landscape of ROI, NPS, and well-being, where we could identify customer populations that, hey, you may think they're valuable, but actually they're declining in their state of well-being. And if they continue to decline, your profit is at risk. And you may think that these customers are unhappy because of the feature or service you provided, but fundamentally, it has to do with their state of well-being. And if you don't address their state of well-being and just try to make the services more frictionless, more easier, it may not necessarily address those challenges.
So when you talk about ROI, there's a time dimension there.
Yes.
So I think often one of the things that people assume is that indeed improving your customers' financial health may indeed accrue to ROI, but it will take a long time to do so. It's not going to move next quarter's earnings report, as an example. Talk to us a little bit about how you all have dealt with that time dimension and whether it's indeed true that these kinds of improvements are really long-term plays as opposed to short-term plays.
They're not completely long-term plays. So, if you think about the fundamental drivers of bank profitability, the most immediate is primarily net interest margin on a risk-adjusted basis on your lending side. Then it's net interest margin on your deposit side. Then it's sort of the depth of the relationship that you have with customers. What we've been able to show is that by focusing on well-being, the lending aspect moves very rapidly. Because when you're able to help consumers better manage their spend, better control their ability to save and repay debt, that has immediate value. And we see very rapid results in that space. And that's where we primarily focused for the first year or two. At the same time, we were building experiences that focused on helping consumers build up savings balances, build up those buffers. And so, of course, that has an impact on your ability to generate profit from the savings side. That takes a longer period of time, of course, because people need time to save. Whereas repayments are immediate, due next month, right? Due the month after. And then finally, as we've started to develop a system of financial well-being, because financial well-being is not about individual interventions. It is actually about creating an integrated solution set that helps consumers manage all of the aspects of their well-being. What behavioral scientists would call choice architecture. How do you set up the way that I make choices about how I'm going to allocate spend as it comes in, savings as it becomes available, and debt as I have to repay it. And when you start to build these systems, what you find is that the relationship also deepens over time. That consumers see value in having multiple products with you because they are working together to support that financial well-being system. We're primarily driving a lot of value in that first space on the lending side. We're starting to see the value generated in the second space. And in the third space, we're starting to see signs that consumers are starting to link together and understand that, I shouldn't be thinking about just buying a product. What I should be thinking about is serving my well-being.
That's really exciting. In the same way that you talk about, this is really an integrated system. That we need to think about it that way. It's true that as an enterprise needs to think about its financial health strategy in an integrated fashion across the entire organization. What's been the biggest challenges for you integrating this at an institution the size of CBA, and what are you still working on?
Yeah, there were a few things. One was infrastructure. So, even with CBA's very advanced capabilities, in terms of being able to work collaboratively with our academic experts, because behavioral science is a rapidly evolving field. And if you are working in the space of financial well-being, you're dealing with challenges that have no clear answers. So, just like an aeronautics company would have partnerships with a material sciences division at a leading university, we knew that having this relationship with those universities was important. There were challenges in getting secure data access, ensuring that fulfilled all of our privacy and all of our other obligations. And so that was hard work. So, it isn't just signing up with the university and saying, let's go do some research together. There's a lot of work that goes into getting that made possible. Second aspect of infrastructure was experimentation. We wanted to make it easy for our partners, business partners, to be able to do experimentation rapidly. And that, in the past would have been a lot of effort. What we've moved towards is what we call zero cost experimentation, building into the infrastructure, automated randomization, automated controls, so that when we build a new feature, a new product, it's actually a push of a button and we can allocate out a control group and a trial group to validate that. So that was the first sort of big challenge, was infrastructure. Second, of course, was working with teams around their constraints. So people have deadlines, marketing typically has, a roadmap of features that they'd like to see out in market. People have KPIs that they need to hit in terms of cost and revenue. And so figuring out how to adapt the scientific method to be able to work in a highly agile way was also a big challenge. And that's going to be specific to every organization. We found our own workarounds, our own ways to solve that. But it took a lot of effort to really work through that so that We could still launch products, but do what we call, for example, encouragement design, where the product is available to all. We may only speak to some of the population about it because they're our trial group. The other population may not have direct marketing associated with it, but if they'd like to find it, they can. And that encouragement design model allows us to run an experiment at scale without creating complexity for the marketing team where they have to go, well, it's not really out in market. We don't know if we can go out with our campaign. Those were the two biggest, I think, challenges. The third, honestly, is more related to the team, which is it's very hard to find people who have this expertise, particularly in the behavioral science space, because doing and applying behavioral science in a large financial services organization is not something every behavioral scientist is equipped to handle. Behavioral science thus far, up until very recently, was an academic track, and it is now turning into an engineering track. And we just don't have enough engineers on the planet to really drive this forward at the scale that I think we will need to over the next few years.
Mm. So many of the people who are listening to this, Mo, are at, in some cases, much smaller institutions. They may be far earlier in their journey. The picture that you've painted of what you've accomplished at CBA is incredibly impressive, but I suspect to folks who are earlier in their journey, it may feel daunting or impossible to replicate. So as we wrap up this session, if there's one piece of advice you could impart to professionals who are interested in improving the financial health of their customers and are really trying to make the business case internally and figure out where to start in terms of building their strategy, what would your advice be?
I would say be part of the Financial Health Network. And that's
it didn't pay him to say that.
No. And that's primarily because I do think that there is a certain scale required to do this level of sophistication. It is very hard work. It does require, and I'm privileged enough to be in an organization that has that ability, the ability to support it at that level. But I also think there's a real importance to creating a community of practice. And I think that's what the Financial Health Network is playing, that critical role of bringing those insights and bringing those proof points and sharing it with the broader community so that more organizations can act on it. We at CBA, for example, through our partnership with Harvard, through our own work in collaboration with the Financial Health Network, are making public as much as possible all of the work that we're doing. Because we know that financial health is too big of a challenge for any one organization to solve. And we know that there are other organizations that have the scale that can continue to build on our insights and add to that insight base. And because we think it is an important way for us to give back to the global community. So for smaller organizations, look for those proof points, look for that evidence. And I think the Financial Health Network is doing a great job of bringing all of that together and making it available in a way that you can act on without necessarily having to try to rebuild these types of capabilities within your own organization.
Mo, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.